the rope still exists. Sitting in UC Berkeley's climate-controlled vault is the actual rope that Blas de Magallanes used to hang himself in his Inquisition cell in 1597, rather than face another day of what his interrogators called enhanced questioning. Next to it, finger bones that another prisoner used for desperate witchcraft rituals, hoping dark magic might save him from systematic torture. These artifacts emerged from a private Mexican family's collection in the 1990s, documents the scholarly world assumed were destroyed. What makes your skin crawl isn't just the physical evidence, it's the medical reports that survived with them. Physicians didn't just supervise torture, they perfected it, writing detailed analyses on optimal pain duration and psychological manipulation techniques. Why were doctors competing for these positions? How did the Inquisition achieve confession rates that modern intelligence agencies envy? And why are their medical methodologies still classified in contemporary military manuals? The history textbooks skip the most disturbing part. This wasn't medieval barbarism, it was scientific cruelty that established templates still in use today. Subscribe now. Because the connections between 16th century torture chambers and modern black sites will make you question everything you think you know about institutional power. But that rope and those bones are just the beginning of what researchers found when they cracked open this collection that had been hidden in a private Mexican home for over a century. And when Professor Ron Hassner first laid eyes on the Manuel de Lucena trial transcript, all 334 pages of it, he had no idea he was about to spend years documenting the most systematic torture program in human history. As he turned each parchment page, that ancient sand I mentioned earlier would literally fall into his lap. And he realized he wasn't just reading history, he was handling the actual physical remnants of torture sessions that took place when Shakespeare was still writing plays. The scribes who created these documents used that sand to absorb excess ink because they needed their records to be perfect, permanent, and legally admissible in courts that spanned 3 continents and operated for over 3 centuries. Every word had to be preserved because the Spanish Inquisition wasn't just torturing people, it was building the world's first global surveillance and interrogation network, complete with standardized procedures, medical oversight, and quality control measures that would make modern intelligence agencies weep with envy. What Hassner discovered in those pages would force him to completely rewrite his understanding of how systematic torture actually works, because the Inquisition had solved problems that contemporary interrogators are still struggling with today. And they documented every breakthrough in excruciating detail. But before we dive into exactly how they achieved confession rates that averaged over 95% across centuries of operations, you need to understand that everything you think you know about the Spanish Inquisition is wrong, and the real story is so much worse than the Hollywood versions that your mind will struggle to accept what these newly discovered documents reveal about the true nature of institutional power and medical complicity. Forget everything you've seen in movies, because those hooded figures with rusty torture devices are actually protecting you from the truth, and Monty Python's bumbling inquisitors who can't even threaten someone properly are a merciful fiction compared to what actually happened in those meticulously organized chambers of systematic suffering. The Hollywood version gives you medieval barbarians acting on religious fury, but the newly opened archives reveal something that will make your blood run cold. This was a modern bureaucracy that happened to operate 4 centuries before we invented the term, complete with organizational charts, performance metrics, and employee handbooks that detailed exactly how to extract confessions while maintaining legal compliance. When researchers finally gained access to the Spanish National Archives in the 1970s after Franco's death, they expected to find scattered records of random religious violence, but instead they discovered the most comprehensive documentation of systematic torture in human history, with case files so detailed that modern forensic psychologists use them to study the long-term effects of institutional trauma. The 334-page Manuel de Lucena trial transcript isn't just one man's torture record, it's a training manual that shows exactly how the Inquisition perfected the art of breaking human beings while keeping them alive and legally compliant. And when you realize that this single case file represents just one of over 67 521 individual records now digitized in the early modern Inquisition database, the true scope of this bureaucratic nightmare becomes terrifyingly clear. These weren't mad zealots acting on impulse. These were trained professionals following standardized procedures that were refined through centuries of systematic experimentation on human subjects. And the medical documents that survived reveal that physicians weren't just present during torture sessions. They were conducting controlled studies on pain tolerance, psychological manipulation, and optimal interrogation techniques that contemporary military psychologists still reference in classified research. But here's what will really disturb you. The Inquisition's confession rate wasn't achieved through more brutal torture than their contemporaries used. It was achieved through better organization, superior documentation, and what modern intelligence analysts now recognize as the most sophisticated psychological warfare program ever implemented. And when you understand how they actually operated, you'll realize why governments around the world still classify their methodologies as state secrets. Because the templates they created for systematic institutional cruelty are still in use today, just wearing different uniforms and speaking different languages. From 1,478 to 1,834, 356 years of continuous operation, the Spanish Inquisition processed over 150 cases across Spain and its colonies. But those numbers don't capture the true horror, because recent analysis of 521 documented cases reveals that this wasn't random violence or religious hysteria. This was systematic institutional torture conducted with the precision of a modern medical procedure. And every arrest, every interrogation, every scream, every confession was recorded in standardized formats that allowed administrators to track performance metrics across decades of operations. When Gustav Henningsen and Jaime Contreras first compiled their database of Inquisition cases in the 1980s, they thought they were documenting medieval brutality. But what they actually discovered was the world's first evidence-based torture program, complete with statistical analysis, quality control measures, and continuous improvement protocols that would make contemporary data scientists uncomfortable with their thoroughness and efficiency. The scope becomes truly terrifying when you realize that these 521 cases represent only the documented survivors, the ones whose files were preserved in archives scattered across 3 continents, which means the actual number of people processed through this system was exponentially higher, and each case file contains enough detail to reconstruct not just what happened to individual victims, but how the entire apparatus functioned as an integrated network of surveillance, arrest, interrogation, and disposal that operated with clockwork precision for over 3 centuries. But here's what will make your skin crawl. Modern forensic analysis of these records reveals that the Inquisition achieved confession rates averaging 95%, not through more brutal torture than their contemporaries, but through superior data collection, psychological profiling, and what intelligence analysts now recognize as the first systematic implementation of social network analysis to identify and eliminate entire communities of targeted individuals. Every name extracted under torture was cross-referenced with existing files. Every relationship was mapped. Every connection was exploited to expand the network of surveillance and control, and the documentation was so thorough that researchers can now reconstruct the social fabric of entire cities and trace how systematic terror spread through communities like a carefully engineered virus designed to destroy human trust. And now, for the first time, we can see exactly what happened in those chambers. But before we dive into the specific methods that would make modern interrogators recoil in horror, you need to understand how this machine of systematic cruelty came to exist. Because the origins of the Spanish Inquisition reveal something disturbing about how quickly any society can transform medical professionals, legal experts, and religious authorities into willing participants in institutionalized torture when the right bureaucratic structures are put in place. Spain, 1478, and Ferdinand and Isabella have just unified a fractured kingdom through marriage and military conquest. But their newly consolidated power faces what they perceive as an existential threat: religious diversity that has allowed Jews, Muslims, and Christians to coexist for centuries in a complex web of commercial, intellectual, and social relationships that the Catholic monarchs view as a direct challenge to absolute royal authority. The tolerance that had made medieval Spain one of Europe's most prosperous and intellectually vibrant regions now represents, in their minds, a cancer that must be surgically removed before it metastasizes into political rebellion, and their solution reveals a level of bureaucratic sophistication that would make modern totalitarian regimes study their methods with professional admiration. On November 1, 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issues the papal bull Exigit Sinceris Devotionis, officially authorizing Ferdinand and Isabella to create the Tribunal del Santo Oficio, the Holy Office of the Inquisition. But what emerges from this papal authorization isn't the chaotic mob violence you might expect. It's something far more terrifying. The world's first systematically organized program of state-sponsored torture designed to operate within legal frameworks that provide the veneer of judicial legitimacy while enabling unprecedented levels of institutional cruelty. This wasn't a mob with torches storming through neighborhoods. This was a carefully constructed legal institution complete with hierarchical command structures, standardized operating procedures, appeals processes, and quality control mechanisms that ensured consistent application of torture techniques across multiple jurisdictions spanning 3 continents. The bureaucratic foundation they established reveals a disturbing understanding of how to transform ordinary citizens into willing participants in systematic torture. They recruited university-educated lawyers to serve as inquisitors, licensed physicians to provide medical oversight, professional scribes to maintain detailed documentation, and local clergy to provide theological justification, creating a multi-layered institutional structure where individual responsibility could be diffused across so many participants that no single person had to confront the full moral weight of what they were collectively enabling. But the true genius of their system wasn't in its organizational structure, it was in how they transformed torture from a crude tool of punishment into a sophisticated instrument of social control that could identify, map, and systematically dismantle entire networks of suspected dissidents while maintaining the legal fiction that they were simply protecting religious orthodoxy. And when Tomás de Torquemada was appointed as the first Grand Inquisitor in 1483, he brought to this position not just religious fanaticism, but administrative brilliance that would establish operational templates still studied in military academies and intelligence training programs today, because he understood that the most effective torture isn't random violence. It's systematic institutional processes that can be refined, standardized, and scaled across vast geographic regions while maintaining consistent results that justify continued expansion of the program. Meet the conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity to escape the escalating persecution of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, families who thought that abandoning their ancestral faith would buy them safety in an increasingly hostile world. But they were catastrophically wrong because the Spanish Inquisition had been specifically designed to target them. And the statistics reveal the genocidal precision of this systematic campaign. In Valencia between 1484 and 1530, 6% of those judged by the Inquisition were of Jewish origin, while in Barcelona between 1484 and 1505, an almost impossible 99.3% of all cases involved conversos. Numbers so extreme, they reveal that this wasn't religious persecution, it was ethnic cleansing disguised as theological purification. These weren't just statistics in dusty ledgers, these were families with names and faces and dreams who had already sacrificed everything they held sacred to survive. Merchants like Abraham Sr., who had served as chief tax collector for the Catholic monarchs and converted to Christianity in 1492 only to watch his children face Inquisition investigations. Teachers like Luis de Leon, who spent 5 years in Inquisition cells despite being a respected professor of theology. Mothers like Elvira del Campo, who was tortured for lighting candles on Friday nights out of habit rather than religious conviction. And children who would grow up never knowing whether their neighbors might report them for refusing to eat pork or for washing their hands too frequently. The conversos had made the desperate calculation that conversion would protect them. But the Inquisition's architects understood that voluntary conversion actually made them more vulnerable, not less, because it created the legal framework necessary to justify systematic surveillance of their private lives. And once you convert, any behavior that suggests you might still maintain Jewish practices becomes evidence of heresy punishable by torture, imprisonment, property confiscation, and death. What makes their situation particularly tragic is that many conversos had genuinely embraced Christianity. Some had even become priests, nuns, or bishops, but the Inquisition operated on the assumption that Jewish blood carried an inherent tendency toward heresy that could never be fully eliminated, a racist ideology that would later inspire similar programs of ethnic cleansing across Europe and beyond. The newly discovered trial records reveal the horrifying intimacy of this persecution. Neighbors reporting each other for suspicious dietary choices, servants testifying about their employers' bathing habits, children encouraged to inform on their parents' private prayers, creating a web of surveillance so comprehensive that converso families lived in constant terror of accidentally revealing some unconscious habit that might trigger an investigation leading to torture chambers where Inquisition physicians would systematically break their bodies while legal scribes recorded every scream for posterity. And what's most disturbing about these early cases is how they established the operational template that would later be applied to Protestants, Muslims, suspected witches, and anyone else who threatened the Inquisition's expanding definition of orthodoxy. Because once you create institutional mechanisms for systematic torture, those mechanisms inevitably find new targets to justify their continued existence. The genius of the Inquisition wasn't in its cruelty, it was in its patience. And when Manuel de Lucena was arrested in Mexico City on May 10, 1594, he had no idea that Inquisition investigators had been systematically building their case against him for 8 months, conducting surveillance on his household, bribing his servants for information about his dietary habits, and carefully documenting every piece of testimony from other conversos who had already been broken in the torture chambers and forced to implicate everyone they knew in their desperate attempts to make the pain stop. They already had physical evidence. Reports that no smoke emerged from his chimney on Saturdays. Testimony that his wife purchased unusually large quantities of vegetables before certain dates, and detailed accounts of suspicious gatherings in his home that witnesses described with the kind of specific detail that only comes from people who have been systematically tortured until they provide exactly the information their interrogators want to hear. The torture wasn't designed to discover truth, it was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to confirm what the inquisitors already suspected, while creating the legal documentation necessary to justify property confiscation and public execution. And this distinction between investigation and confirmation reveals something deeply disturbing about how institutional torture actually functions when it's designed by intelligent administrators rather than sadistic individuals acting on impulse. But here's where the psychological architecture becomes truly diabolical. From the moment of arrest, victims were held in complete sensory and informational isolation, locked in windowless cells where they had no way of knowing who had betrayed them, what evidence existed against them, what charges they faced, or when the interrogations would begin, creating a state of perpetual anxiety that modern psychological research has identified as one of the most effective methods of breaking human resistance without requiring any physical torture at all. Imagine being Manuel de Lucena, a successful merchant with a wife and children, suddenly torn from your normal life and thrust into a stone cell where the only human contact comes from guards who refuse to speak to you, where meals arrive at irregular intervals to disrupt your sense of time, where you spend weeks or months trying to guess which of your friends, family members, or business associates might have provided the testimony that led to your arrest, and where every sound in the corridor might signal the beginning of interrogation sessions that you know will involve systematic torture designed to force you to confess to crimes you may or may not have committed. This psychological warfare was documented with clinical precision by Inquisition administrators who understood that the anticipation of pain is often more effective than pain itself, and their operational manuals contain detailed instructions for maximizing psychological pressure through strategic use of uncertainty, isolation, and carefully timed escalation of interrogation intensity. techniques that contemporary military psychologists still study as examples of how to systematically break human resistance while maintaining plausible deniability about the use of torture. The newly discovered case files reveal that most victims confessed before any physical torture was applied, simply because the psychological pressure of prolonged isolation, combined with the knowledge that torture was inevitable, became unbearable. And this reveals something terrifying about how sophisticated institutional cruelty can be when it's designed by people who understand that the human mind is often more vulnerable than the human body. Here's what will shock you most about these newly discovered documents. The Spanish Inquisition employed teams of physicians not to heal the victims of torture, but to perfect the application of suffering in ways that would maximize information extraction while minimizing the risk of premature death that might interrupt interrogation sessions before confessions were obtained. Recently discovered medical records from the Spanish National Archives reveal that doctors weren't just occasionally consulted during torture sessions, they were permanent staff members whose job descriptions included detailed specifications for monitoring vital signs, assessing pain tolerance, and making clinical recommendations about which torture methods would be most effective for individual victims based on their age, physical condition, and psychological profile. These weren't back-alley butchers or sadistic amateurs, these were university-trained physicians who competed for Inquisition positions because they offered excellent salaries, social prestige, and legal immunity from prosecution, and their medical reports read like clinical studies in systematic torture optimization that would make contemporary bioethicists physically ill with their casual discussions of human suffering as a measurable scientific phenomenon. Take the case of Ana Acosta, a 15-year-old converso girl from Seville who was imprisoned for allegedly practicing Judaism, and when prison guards found her naked in her cell, claiming she was receiving visits from a person in white robes, the attending physician diagnosed her with hypochondriac melancholia, caused by an imbalance of humors in her gastrointestinal system. But here's the detail that reveals the true horror of medical complicity. His treatment recommendation wasn't to stop her torture or release her from prison. It was to make her happy and feed her specific foods, including beef heads, legs, and feet for lunch, and eggs, almonds, and endive salads for dinner to warm her humors and restore her psychological balance so she could continue to be interrogated effectively. But the physician also noted, almost as an afterthought, that Ana had gangrene in her foot that required immediate surgical intervention, a detail that suggests her melancholia might have been delirium caused by sepsis from an infected wound. Yet instead of questioning whether systemic infection might explain her hallucinations, the medical team treated her foot infection while continuing to support her psychological torture on the grounds that her symptoms indicated spiritual corruption rather than medical crisis. This case illustrates how Inquisition physicians systematically reinterpreted symptoms of physical illness, psychological trauma, and torture-induced psychosis as evidence of heretical behavior that justified continued imprisonment and interrogation, creating medical documentation that provided scientific legitimacy for systematic torture, while allowing physicians to maintain the fiction that they were providing humanitarian care to spiritually corrupted individuals. The medical ethics violations documented in these archives are so extensive that contemporary physicians who study them often experience what researchers call moral injury, the psychological trauma that occurs when medical professionals are forced to confront evidence of how their profession has been systematically corrupted by institutional evil. And what's most disturbing is that these Inquisition medical practices established templates for physician participation in state-sponsored torture that reappear with shocking consistency across different historical periods, geographical locations, from Nazi medical experiments to CIA torture programs, revealing that the corruption of medical ethics isn't an aberration, but a predictable outcome when physicians are embedded within institutional structures that prioritize information extraction over human welfare. The Inquisition developed three primary interrogation methods that historians now recognize as foundational to understanding how institutional torture became systematized in early modern Europe. And what makes these techniques historically significant isn't their cruelty, but their bureaucratic precision and medical oversight that transformed what had previously been random acts of violence into standardized procedures with documented protocols, time limits, and measurable outcomes that could be replicated across different tribunals and geographical locations. The garrucha, also known as strappado, involved suspension techniques that were carefully regulated by Inquisition physicians who monitored sessions to prevent fatal outcomes while ensuring maximum psychological impact. With documented session lengths of exactly 60 minutes that represented a calculated balance between effectiveness and legal liability, since Inquisition regulations explicitly prohibited torture that resulted in permanent disability or death that might undermine the legal validity of confessions obtained through these methods. The toca, which historians recognize as an early form of what contemporary analysts call controlled drowning, involved precisely measured water volumes up to 7 pints, according to surviving medical records administered under physician supervision, using techniques that created the physiological sensation of drowning while allowing interrogators to maintain complete control over the victim's survival. And what's most historically significant about this method is how Inquisition administrators developed standardized protocols that could be taught to interrogators across the Spanish Empire, ensuring consistent application of psychological pressure techniques that maximized confession rates while minimizing legal complications. The potro, commonly known as the rack, reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Inquisition systematization: the bureaucratic documentation requirements that mandated detailed record-keeping of every procedural step, with attending scribes required to document not just confessions but the specific mechanical adjustments made during sessions, creating archives that modern historians can analyze to understand exactly how institutional torture functioned as a legal process rather than arbitrary violence. What makes these historical records particularly valuable for understanding the development of systematic institutional cruelty is how they reveal the intersection of legal, medical, and administrative systems that transformed individual acts of brutality into standardized procedures that could be scaled across vast territories and sustained across multiple generations of practitioners, establishing organizational templates that would later be adapted by various authoritarian regimes throughout history. The surviving documentation shows that Inquisition torture wasn't designed for immediate results, but for systematic psychological destruction that would not only extract confessions from individual victims, but create community-wide terror that discouraged resistance to institutional authority. And this strategic approach to psychological warfare represents one of the earliest examples of state-sponsored programs designed to use systematic suffering as a tool of social control rather than simple punishment. But here's the most chilling detail that reveals the true institutional nature of Inquisition operations. Every interrogation session was attended by professional court scribes whose explicit job description, preserved in administrative manuals, required them to write down everything that the inquisitor or inquisitors say to the prisoner and what the prisoner says in return, creating a documentation system so comprehensive that modern legal historians consider it one of the most complete records of systematic institutional interrogation ever preserved. These weren't hastily scrawled notes taken by amateur record keepers. These were official court documents produced by university-trained scribes who understood that their records would be subject to review by superior courts, appeals processes, and administrative audits, which meant every page had to meet exacting standards of legibility, accuracy, and legal admissibility that required them to use fine sand to blot excess ink and prevent smearing that might compromise the document's legal validity. The same sand that UC Berkeley researchers find sifting from 400-year-old pages today represents physical evidence of the obsessive care these scribes took to ensure their documentation would survive for centuries as legally binding testimony. And this attention to documentary permanence reveals something deeply disturbing about how institutional torture functions. When it's designed by administrators who understand that systematic cruelty requires systematic documentation to maintain legal legitimacy across extended periods of operation, the obsessive thoroughness of this record-keeping system becomes truly horrifying when you realize what these scribes were actually documenting. Not just confessions and legal testimony, but detailed accounts of physiological responses to interrogation techniques, precise timing of various procedural steps, medical observations about victims' physical and psychological condition, and administrative notes about which methods produce the most reliable results with different categories of prisoners. They recorded verbatim transcripts of everything spoken during sessions, including prayers, pleas for mercy, and involuntary vocalizations, creating archives that allow contemporary historians to reconstruct not just what happened in these chambers, but how victims experienced systematic institutional torture. And this level of documentary detail serves multiple institutional functions that reveal the sophisticated administrative thinking behind Inquisition operations. The preservation of these records for posterity wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate institutional strategy designed to create legal precedents, training materials for future interrogators, and bureaucratic accountability systems that would allow supervisors to evaluate the performance of individual tribunal operations across the Spanish Empire. And what's most disturbing is how these documentation requirements transformed scribes from neutral court reporters into active participants in systematic torture who understood that their careful record-keeping was essential to the legal and administrative machinery that made institutional cruelty possible on an unprecedented scale. Manuel de Lucena was a Portuguese merchant living in Mexico City in the 1590s, a successful businessman who had built a prosperous life in the New World while secretly maintaining the Jewish faith that his family had been forced to abandon generations earlier in Portugal. And his story, preserved in the 334-page trial record that researchers discovered in UC Berkeley's archives, reveals how the Inquisition's systematic approach to community destruction worked not through random violence, but through carefully orchestrated social network analysis that could identify, map, and systematically dismantle entire communities of suspected dissidents. The document reveals that de Lucena wasn't just a merchant, he was a community leader who had become the central figure in a network of conversos who gathered in his home for religious observances, shared traditional foods, and maintained cultural practices that connected them to their ancestral heritage, making him an ideal target for Inquisition investigators who understood that breaking one central figure could provide access to dozens of other potential cases through forced testimony and systematic interrogation. When they arrested him on May 10, 1594, the Inquisition had already spent months building their case through surveillance, informants, and preliminary interrogations of other community members, which meant that by the time de Lucena found himself in an Inquisition cell, investigators already possessed detailed knowledge about his relationships, his religious practices, and his role in the broader converso community that they would use to systematically extract confessions and accusations that would expand their operations exponentially. The progressive destruction documented in his trial record follows the standard Inquisition protocol. First, isolation and psychological pressure designed to break his resistance, then systematic interrogation sessions that forced him to provide detailed information about his own religious practices, and finally, the devastating phase where continued interrogation pressure compelled him to implicate over 100 members of his community, including friends, family members, business associates, and people he had tried to protect, creating a cascading network of arrests that would ultimately destroy the entire converso community in Mexico City. Every name he provided under interrogation was carefully recorded by attending scribes. Every relationship was documented and cross-referenced with existing case files, and every piece of information was systematically analyzed to identify new targets for arrest and investigation, revealing how the Inquisition had developed what modern intelligence analysts would recognize as sophisticated social network mapping techniques that could transform a single arrest into community-wide surveillance and persecution operations. The final outcome documented in these archives represents the logical endpoint of this systematic approach. In 1596, Manuel de Lucena, his wife Catalina Henriquez, and dozens of other community members whose names he had been forced to provide were executed in a public auto da fe in Mexico City's main square. But what makes this case particularly significant for understanding institutional torture is how the detailed documentation reveals that these executions weren't the result of religious fanaticism, but the predictable outcome of a bureaucratic process designed to use systematic interrogation techniques to identify, prosecute, and eliminate entire communities of people whose only crime was maintaining cultural and religious practices that threatened the Inquisition's vision of religious and social uniformity. Recent analysis of the newly digitized Inquisition archives reveals statistics that expose the terrifying efficiency of this systematic approach to institutional interrogation. Physical torture was actually applied in only 2% of documented cases, because the psychological pressure created by isolation, uncertainty, and the credible threat of systematic suffering was usually sufficient to produce confessions without requiring any physical intervention at all, demonstrating that the Inquisition's architects had developed sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation that contemporary intelligence agencies are only beginning to fully appreciate. When physical interrogation techniques were deemed necessary, they were applied for a maximum of 15 minutes per session, according to strict medical and legal protocols designed to maximize psychological impact, while minimizing the risk of death or permanent disability that might compromise the legal validity of confessions obtained through these methods. And this precise time limitation reveals the systematic nature of Inquisition operations that prioritized sustainable institutional procedures over individual sadistic impulses. The statistics become even more revealing when you examine repetition rates. Physical interrogation was repeated in only 1% of all cases because a single properly conducted session was usually sufficient to break resistance and produce the detailed confessions and community intelligence that investigators required. And it was never applied a third time according to documented institutional protocols, because subjects either provided the required information after 2 sessions or died from the physical stress of systematic interrogation, revealing the calculated efficiency of procedures designed to extract maximum information with minimum institutional liability. But here's the psychological insight that makes these statistics truly disturbing. The Inquisition's architects understood something that modern interrogation specialists are only now learning through psychological research, that the anticipation of systematic suffering is often more effective than the actual application of physical techniques. Because human psychology is wired to experience prolonged anxiety and uncertainty as more traumatic than brief periods of intense but predictable physical stress. The entire institutional system was designed around this principle of psychological terror, backed by the credible threat of precisely calibrated physical intervention, creating what contemporary psychologists recognize as one of the most sophisticated programs of systematic psychological warfare ever implemented, where the mere existence of documented torture capabilities, combined with isolation, uncertainty, and social pressure, could produce confession rates that exceeded 95% across centuries of operations, without requiring extensive use of physical techniques that might attract unwanted attention from external observers or create administrative complications for tribunal operations. This statistical efficiency reveals something deeply disturbing about how institutional torture actually functions when it's designed by intelligent administrators rather than implemented by individual sadists. The most effective systematic cruelty isn't random violence, but carefully calibrated psychological pressure that exploits fundamental vulnerabilities in human psychology while maintaining the bureaucratic structures necessary to sustain operations across extended periods and vast geographical territories. And these efficiency statistics explain why governments throughout history have repeatedly adopted Inquisition methodologies despite their obvious moral and legal problems, because they represent proven techniques for systematic social control that can be implemented by ordinary people working within institutional frameworks that diffuse individual responsibility while maximizing collective effectiveness. The most disturbing discovery in these newly opened archives isn't the specific interrogation methods documented in thousands of case files. It's the systematic medical participation that transformed what might have been random acts of violence into scientifically supervised procedures that could be refined, standardized, and justified through professional medical authority that provided institutional legitimacy for systematic cruelty conducted under the guise of legal and therapeutic intervention. Physicians actively competed for positions with the Inquisition because these roles provided substantial social status within Spanish colonial society. Legal protection from prosecution under civil or ecclesiastical law, and financial compensation that exceeded what most medical practitioners could earn in private practice, creating a professional incentive structure that attracted some of the most talented and well-educated physicians in the Spanish Empire to become willing participants in institutional torture programs. In exchange for these professional benefits, physicians became essential accomplices to systematic interrogation by providing medical examinations designed to assess victims' capacity to survive specific procedures, continuous monitoring during sessions to prevent deaths that might compromise legal proceedings, and post-session medical treatment designed not to provide humanitarian care but to restore victims to physical conditions suitable for continued interrogation until confessions were obtained or legal proceedings were completed. The ethical corruption documented in these medical reports reveals how professional medical authority was systematically corrupted to provide scientific legitimacy for institutional cruelty, with physicians writing detailed clinical analyses that reframed systematic torture as therapeutic intervention designed to save victims' souls from eternal damnation, while simultaneously advancing medical understanding of human physiological responses to controlled stress, creating documentation that allowed institutional administrators to maintain the fiction that their operations served humanitarian rather than purely political purposes. What makes this historical medical complicity particularly disturbing is how closely it parallels contemporary cases of physician participation in systematic torture. In 2005, American physicians participated in enhanced interrogation techniques at military facilities, including Guantanamo Bay, using remarkably similar justifications about national security, legal authorization from superior authorities, and professional duty to prevent serious harm to detainees, revealing that the corruption of medical ethics isn't a historical aberration but a predictable pattern that emerges whenever institutional structures create professional incentives for physicians to prioritize organizational loyalty over medical ethics. The parallels extend beyond individual participation to include systematic institutional mechanisms. Both historical and contemporary cases involve medical professionals who rationalize their participation through claims about preventing greater harm, legal authorization from legitimate authorities, and professional duty to provide medical oversight that would minimize rather than eliminate systematic cruelty, and both cases produced extensive medical documentation designed to provide scientific legitimacy for procedures that violated fundamental principles of medical ethics while maintaining plausible deniability about the systematic nature of institutional torture programs that these medical professionals enabled through their willing participation and professional authority. For centuries, the full extent of Inquisition documentation remained hidden from scholarly analysis because Spanish and Vatican authorities maintained strict control over archival access, keeping the most detailed records locked away in climate-controlled vaults, where only a handful of approved researchers could examine carefully selected materials under heavy supervision, while thousands of additional documents remained scattered across private family collections, monastery libraries, and colonial archives throughout Latin America, where they gathered dust in forgotten storage rooms. But starting in the 1970s, a combination of political changes, technological advances, and generational shifts in archival management began to transform scholarly access to these historical records. The death of Francisco Franco in 1975 led to gradual liberalization of Spanish archival policies, while simultaneous developments in document preservation, digital scanning, and database management made it feasible for the first time to systematically catalog and analyze the enormous volume of Inquisition documentation that had been accumulating for nearly 5 centuries. Archives that had been completely closed to researchers suddenly opened their doors, revealing thousands of previously unknown case files, administrative records, and institutional correspondence that painted a dramatically different picture of Inquisition operations than the fragmentary evidence that had been available to earlier generations of historians. While private collectors began donating or selling family collections like the Mexican Inquisition documents that eventually found their way to UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library, bringing to light complete trial records that scholars had assumed were destroyed centuries ago. Digital databases allowed comprehensive quantitative analysis of Inquisition operations for the first time in history, enabling researchers like Gustav Henningsen and Jaime Contreras to compile statistical profiles of over 67,000 individual cases and identify patterns of systematic institutional behavior that had been invisible when historians could only examine scattered individual documents rather than comprehensive datasets that revealed the true scope and sophistication of Inquisition operations across multiple centuries and geographical regions. What researchers discovered when they finally gained access to these comprehensive archives challenged everything that historians thought they knew about the nature of early modern religious persecution, because the documentation revealed that this wasn't chaotic religious violence driven by fanatical individuals acting on theological impulses, but systematic, scientific, bureaucratized institutional torture conducted by university-trained legal professionals, supervised by licensed medical experts, and documented with obsessive precision that created operational templates still studied by contemporary intelligence agencies and military organizations. The revelation of this bureaucratic horror fundamentally transformed scholarly understanding of how systematic institutional cruelty actually functions in practice, leading political scientist Ron Hassner to conclude that the Inquisition represented torture that worked, not because it was more brutal than contemporary alternatives, but because it was more systematic, more carefully documented, and more precisely calibrated to exploit psychological vulnerabilities while maintaining legal and medical legitimacy that allowed these operations to continue for over 3 centuries without generating sufficient external opposition to force institutional reforms. The Spanish Inquisition was officially abolished in 1834. But the institutional template it established, systematic torture, justified by appeals to higher authority, supervised by medical professionals, and implemented through bureaucratic structures that diffuse individual responsibility, while maximizing organizational effectiveness, has reappeared with disturbing consistency across different historical periods, geographical locations, and political systems that otherwise seem to have little in common beyond their willingness to use institutional frameworks to legitimize systematic cruelty against targeted populations. The pattern emerges clearly when you examine the documented operations of Nazi medical experiments, Soviet psychiatric torture programs, Chilean military intelligence operations under Pinochet, and American enhanced interrogation techniques implemented at black sites after 9/11. Because each of these cases involved the same essential elements that made Inquisition torture so devastatingly effective: legal authorization from legitimate governmental authority, medical supervision that provided scientific legitimacy for systematic cruelty, and comprehensive documentation designed to create institutional accountability, while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of operations that were presented to external observers as necessary security measures rather than systematic torture programs. The uncomfortable truth that emerges from comparative analysis of these historical cases is that each time these institutions were created, the perpetrators genuinely believed their cause justified their methods, with participants ranging from individual interrogators to senior administrators convincing themselves that their systematic torture served higher purposes like national security, ideological purity, or social order that outweighed the obvious moral and legal problems created by their willingness to use institutional authority to inflict systematic suffering on targeted individuals and communities. Each time, medical professionals provided crucial legitimacy by reframing systematic torture as therapeutic intervention, scientific research, or humanitarian oversight designed to minimize harm while serving essential institutional goals, creating professional documentation that allowed administrators to maintain the fiction that their operations served medical and scientific purposes rather than purely political objectives designed to terrorize specific populations into submission or compliance with governmental authority. Each time, bureaucrats created comprehensive documentation systems that recorded every aspect of systematic torture operations with obsessive precision, generating archives that would later provide historians with detailed evidence of institutional cruelty, while simultaneously creating the administrative structures necessary to sustain these operations across extended periods and vast geographical territories without generating sufficient internal opposition to force institutional reforms. And each time these systematic torture programs were eventually exposed and discontinued, society expressed shock and moral outrage while promising that such institutional cruelty would never be permitted to develop again. Yet the archives of the Spanish Inquisition reveal an uncomfortable truth about human nature and institutional behavior. Given the right combination of perceived external threats, legitimate governmental authority, professional incentive structures, and bureaucratic mechanisms that diffuse individual responsibility, virtually any society can construct institutions of systematic cruelty that transform ordinary citizens into willing participants in programs of organized torture that they rationalize as necessary responses to extraordinary circumstances that justify extraordinary measures. Remember that sand falling from 400-year-old pages in UC Berkeley's archives when researchers first opened the Manuel de Lucena trial record? It's still falling today. And every time historians handle these documents, more sand sifts through their fingers like an hourglass marking time that refuses to stop, creating a physical reminder that connects us directly to the scribes who used that same sand to blot excess ink as they recorded systematic torture sessions with the same obsessive care that contemporary bureaucrats use to document the operations they believe serve legitimate institutional purposes. The sand becomes a metaphor for something far more disturbing than historical curiosity. It's a tangible connection to the reality that the capacity for systematic institutional cruelty isn't ancient history safely contained in museum displays, but human nature waiting for the right combination of perceived threats, legitimate authority, professional incentives, and bureaucratic structures that can transform ordinary citizens into willing participants in systematic torture programs that they rationalize as necessary responses to extraordinary circumstances. Every grain of sand that falls from these pages represents not just historical evidence, but a warning about institutional patterns that continue to emerge in contemporary society whenever governments create the legal, medical, and administrative frameworks necessary to implement systematic cruelty while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of operations that are presented to external observers as legitimate security measures rather than torture programs designed to terrorize targeted populations into submission. The scribes who created these documents preserved their records with obsessive care because they genuinely believed they were documenting righteous work that served higher purposes like religious orthodoxy, social order, and institutional security. And they never imagined that future generations would examine their meticulous documentation and see them as chroniclers of systematic evil rather than faithful servants of legitimate authority. Which raises the deeply uncomfortable question of what institutions operating in our contemporary world are creating similar archives that future historians might view with equivalent horror and moral revulsion. What systematic cruelty is being documented with similar bureaucratic precision in climate-controlled government facilities, corporate data centers, and institutional archives around the world right now? And what sand will fall from the documents being created today when future researchers examine the operational records of contemporary institutions that their participants believe serve legitimate purposes, but that history may judge as systematic torture programs disguised as legal, medical, or security operations? If this investigation into the hidden archives of systematic institutional evil has fundamentally shaken your understanding of how ordinary people become complicit in organized cruelty through bureaucratic structures that diffuse individual responsibility while maximizing collective harm, then subscribe to this channel because next week we're opening the classified files on a modern institution whose own internal documents reveal psychological manipulation techniques, medical supervision protocols, and systematic documentation procedures that would make Spanish Inquisition physicians proud of their institutional descendants. The pattern established by the Inquisition never really ended it. Just evolved new institutional forms, adopted contemporary professional vocabularies, and found new bureaucratic homes where the same essential elements of systematic torture continue to operate under different names and legal justifications, and the evidence is all there waiting in climate-controlled vaults and digital archives for someone brave enough to let the sand fall and confront the uncomfortable truth that the capacity for institutional evil isn't safely contained in historical museums but actively present in contemporary society, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge again.